There are a lot of books out there that say very little about anything. They're not interesting, they don't contribute anything, but this video is not about them. This video is about one of my favorite books of the 21st century because it's something that I like to call like a matrix book, a book that helps you understand everything about everything, even though it's about something really specific. Carbon Democracy by Timothy Mitchell is one of my favorite books because it helps us understand how energy and politics don't just shape our environments, our relationships, but they shape almost every single aspect of our world. Mitchell asks a really important question. Why is it that we think democracy and fossil fuels are mutually exclusive? Has that always been the case? Instead, Mitchell argues that fundamentally, fossil fuels and democratic politics have always been intertwined since the beginning. When Mitchell wrote this book, he was going against the historical grain by arguing that the rise of oil didn't just handicap Middle Eastern democracies, it transformed democratic power everywhere, especially in the West. The so-called oil curse that a lot of historians and politicians and economists have talked about in the early 2000s, it actually simplifies the story, according to Mitchell. The oil curse, also known as the resource curse, is this idea that countries with more abundant natural resources actually experience slower economic growth and more corruption and more instability than countries with fewer natural resources. But as Mitchell argues, most commentators, when they're thinking about oil countries or talking about oil money, they're just focused on government revenues or the private riches that people amass from oil, instead of looking at the very nature of oil itself, or the complex systems required to produce, distribute, and use oil. Therefore, the oil curse is not just a problem for oil-rich governments, instead it's tied to global processes that help us understand the rise of affluence and power everywhere, not just in cursed governments. When coal was used to fuel industrial societies across the world, the workers were actually able to build power through collective action and strikes, setting the stage for modern democracies. Strikes were made possible in the early 20th century in part because these states were vulnerable because of their coal dependence. Labor movements used these weaknesses to push for democratic rights and better working conditions. But oil changed the rules. Oil required fewer workers and could be extracted on the surface under constant supervision. Pipelines and tankers made shipping easy, spreading oil all across continents, making a world market. Oil companies no longer depended on local labor, meaning they could bypass strikes and undermine worker power. And as oil became even more dominant, industrialists working with the state moved to undermine labor and unions even further. Mitchell shows how pipelines were designed to break strikes, some of the earliest examples being in the United States. As the 20th century marched on, the abundance of Middle Eastern oil further undermined Western labor's leverage. By moving energy production abroad, Western states gained flexibility and lost the vulnerability that once handed power to workers. Oil didn't just transform labor, it also totally changed world politics. After World War II, the United States gained its global oil dominance by reorganizing Europe's economy around petroleum, notably through the Marshall Plan. With this post-war emphasis on oil, the idea of peacetime national security emerged, with oil sales and arms sales going hand in hand. Today, our reliance on oil and gas restricts other energy options. Politicians across the spectrum promise lower gas prices or more drilling instead of pursuing more sustainable energy alternatives. Mitchell warns that democracy is going to be further tested as energy supplies dwindle and extraction becomes more and more desperate across the world. The American political system remains captive to the status quo. It's not just a problem in the Middle East. We have oil lobbyists here who are spending millions to block climate regulation and to pursue more drill baby drill policies. Simply increasing drilling or fracking isn't a solution to our energy problem or our democracy problem. To keep up with our current demand, we would have to discover oil fields the size of Saudi Arabia every 4 years. That's impossible. Mitchell's larger point about our transition to renewable energy is that it's going to take more than just technological innovation. It's going to take a complete rethinking of our democracy and our economy. So here's a quick summary of this book. The power of carbon energy, it doesn't just come from dictatorships, it has always depended on the structures of our democracies. However, if the story ended here, we would feel stuck in this place of permanent cynicism, feeling trapped by the oil regime's corrosive grip on our politics, our environment, and our whole lives. Instead, Mitchell's analysis explains why efforts for the Green New Deal have been vital, and why fights for climate action have always been inseparable for the fight for democracy itself. It can feel confusing at times. Why does climate action also look like a struggle for public utilities, a fight for economic justice, a fight for BIPOC communities and poor communities across the country, a fight for labor rights for everyone, a fight for a democracy that actually represents everyone and our planet, not just the moneyed interests. Well, carbon democracy helps us explain why. Oil doesn't just pollute our air and heat the planet, it also ruins the very mechanisms we use to govern ourselves. At the Sunrise Movement, we know we're not just fighting for decarbonization. We're fighting for economic justice, for collective ownership, for actual strengthened democratic power across the country. This is a strategic necessity because building a society that's powered by renewables requires more than just swapping our oil for solar power. It's going to require creating new systems of participation, collective ownership, and accountability that can fight against big oil's legacy of suppression and control. Carbon democracy shows us what is at stake. Energy and climate solutions that can actually fight climate change, as well as restore and deepen our faith in democracy, so that we can all decide collectively on the livable and just future that we deserve. Join us at the Sunrise Movement at the link in our bio to learn more.